Question: have your thighs ever rubbed together, creating a rash because of friction? Chafe is no joke, but thanks to Megababe, it's also no problem. Thigh Rescue is the anti-chafe stick made for chafers by chafers. Get Megababe's Thigh Rescue and experience what 10,000 five-star reviewers rave about. Thigh Rescue stops chafe. With one sold every 30 seconds, you better run to megababebeauty.com.
Okay, old favorite, hadn't been here for a while. He's been busy. He's going to tell us why he's been busy with here in just a second. Our friends from Consumer Choice Center. He's also got his own podcasting and radio gigs. David Clement is back after too long of an absence, my friend. Good to see you again.
Good to see you too. Thank you for having me.
Always a pleasure to have you. Okay, here's an interesting one. We've been talking about housing a lot. We've been talking about it with our UK friends where it's really getting hairy over there. We've been talking about it here in America where it's not quite to that level, but it's kind of heading that way. Canada has been having all sorts of housing issues, especially places like Toronto, Vancouver, the major cities. Which is really funny because, you know, I'm a nerd. I watch HGTVs. A lot of those HGTV house shows started in Canada, and now they got to film them in Raleigh because, you know, people's like, why is this house $1 million?
Yep.
It's been a problem up there. You've written about it for years that I've known you. You've got policy answers on this, but now you got kind of a personal perspective on this too, don't you?
I do. So we've spent the better part of the last 3 months looking at houses in what you would consider the GTA, or like the outer outskirts of the GTA. And for a long time, this has been a really uncomfortable housing market price-wise, where it is just incredibly difficult for a variety of reasons to get into the housing market. So one, prices are through the roof. And just as a funny kind of story, if you are a Jeopardy fan, Matea Roach, Canadian who went on a really, I think it would be best described as a heater on Jeopardy, won about $560,000 on her run in Jeopardy. And someone asked her, "Oh, well, what are you going to do with the prize money? Because that should be like life-changing money." And she said, "Well, that'll be a good down payment on a house in Toronto." And whoever it was who was interviewing her had asked, or had said, "Wait, a down payment? That's not the whole thing?" And no, it is not. The average home price at the time was like the median house was something like 1.15 million, 1.2 million. So really high prices. There are laws in place for the deposit. And so as soon as you get over $1 million, you have to put 20% down. So you have to have 200 grand liquid to put down, which not many young people have. That's like decades worth of savings for your kind of ordinary millennial who's doing well for themselves, who's kind of cost and budget conscious. So it's very difficult. Now, some of those prices have come down recently. We're seeing a bit of a crunch with rising interest rates right now. I think a lot of people who were speculating on real estate, who bought, let's say, from 2020 to 6 months ago, are feeling the pinch because the mortgage payments with the rising rates don't match what you can get for rent. So the idea that you could, if you can't sell a home, you can just rent it, you're going to eat the loss. And so we're seeing a lot of homes come on the market where homes have sat empty for, let's say, 3-4 months, and that is just too much of a burn rate for a lot of people to stomach. And so houses are starting to go back down. They're dipping below the $1 million mark. Doesn't mean it's that much more affordable for buyers, because it's harder to qualify for a mortgage these days than it was 2 years ago, with rates being what they are. But we're starting to see some type of adjustment. It's not any type of collapse, I would call it, but we are seeing some sort of price adjustment but not much of an adjustment in terms of overall affordability, unfortunately.
Yeah, David Clement joining us. Here's the thing. We all talk policy stuff. We're pundits. This is what we do. We give ideas
Mm-hmm.
and throw stuff out there. Then when you got to go through it yourself, it kind of changes your perspective a little bit.
Yep.
Talk about that, because when you actually have to do it, here's the disconnect. And here's something I work really hard on, because it's easy to just sit here and say stuff into the microphone, into the camera, or write a piece and fire it off and get it published somewhere. That's one thing. There's a real disconnect between the pundit sphere and the talking heads, and especially the policy sphere, which is its own separate thing where people just sit and do the think tank thing. And I'm not knocking them. That's what they do.
No,
There's a big disconnect between that and the average person that they're supposed to be reaching. There's a communication gap. There's, dare I say, sometimes an empathy gap of like, hey, this stuff is hard to implement, and even the best ideas implemented wrongly can be a disaster. Talk about that part of it, because like you've been talking about housing since I've met you a couple of years ago. Now you went through the process. It should refine how you think about an issue like this, right?
Yeah. So I think the biggest takeaway for me is, so let's say we saw 30 houses. I would say that 20 of them were vacant. So that suggests to you that they're investment properties. They're not, primarily speaking, they're not someone's primary residence that they're moving out of. So the folks on the left kind of see that as the boogeyman, like that's the reason why housing is so expensive. Ultimately, I think I downplayed the extent to which people are speculating on real estate. So I was probably wrong in terms of how large that section of the market is. But what's funny is I still think that my policy prescription is accurate to try and solve it. Now, some of that is correcting for itself with rising rates. But the policy prescription, I've always said, because people will complain, they'll be like, oh, on the right, the boogeyman is foreign buyers, right? We don't want foreign buyers. We have to ban foreign buyers. On the left, it's banning, let's say, a second property purchases or third, wherever you draw the line. But realistically, I think the answer, if you want to, if those people are in air quotes bad, and I don't think they're necessarily bad, they're responding to incentives. If you want to stick it to them, the best way to stick it to them is to increase the housing supply and create a lot more competition in what's on offer in the market. And we're starting to see a lot more effort at the provincial level on that. The Premier of Ontario, Ontario's governor for American listeners, is wanting to build over 1 million new homes to try and alleviate some of this crunch. I think that's really the best way to stick it to investors or to foreign buyers, is to create competition where you don't see that asset inflation of 15-20% per year. I mean, so a single family home in the Greater Toronto area throughout the pandemic outperformed and all of the major hedge funds on Wall Street in terms of returns. That is completely unsustainable. And the best way to counter that is to just increase supply so that you have more options for people looking to enter the market. But more importantly, you have more options across the spectrum for people entering the market. So if I think back to my sister's generation, she's 10 years older than me. They had the opportunity to buy something modest as their first home, live there for 5 or so years, have a child, kind of outgrow that house, and use the equity to then move up the housing ladder. That doesn't exist at all anymore. If you're a millennial and you have kids, it's essentially you're renting in that type of modest home. You're then outgrowing it, and you're taking a big leap to that kind of more forever home, the type of house you can live in for let's say 20, 25 years. So that's the uncomfortable situation a lot of folks like myself are dealing with right now, is being able to make that leap, which is very tough. But I do think at the end of the day, the best way to counter any of the boogeymen out there is to just increase supply and do so in a meaningful way. which we are starting to see some YIMBY, yes in my backyard pressure with the decision makers in the provinces, who are ultimately the final say on a lot of the provinces and the municipalities are the final say on housing.
Yeah, David Clement joining us. You just touched on it, and I don't want to gloss over it because it's the part of the housing thing people don't want to talk about. Equity is wealth, and it's generational wealth for a lot of folks. They inherit a property or they inherit that's not happening. That chain has been broken, like you just talked about. But that's the gap, is getting into the first home, because once you have the first home, then you have equity to maybe get another home or to renovate the one you're in or whatever the case may be. Getting that gap in, and if you have policies like bad mortgages or high risk mortgages, which makes the problem even worse, that furthers that gap, and it also hurts the greater market. That's the entry point of all the problems right here, is getting those first time homeowners into a home in an affordable way. That's really the crux of this whole mess. That's where all the policy stuff, that's the rubber meeting the road, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think what you're going to start to see over the course of 2023 is a lot of the first-time home buyers who bought on a variable rate mortgage during the pandemic really feel the pinch. And so you're at, like I said, your average home, let's say, and this is your median home, like your average house in the GTA, let's say $1 million. Your mortgage rate from, let's say you got it at the lowest variable, would have been 1.6 to 2.1%. You're now looking at 4.8 to 5.6%. Incomes have not gone up, have not doubled in that time period. Cost of living has gone up in terms of the inflationary pressure on everything else, groceries, etc. So I think you're going to see a lot of those buyers reevaluate who bought what we'll look back at as the top. They bought at the top at the cheapest they could afford, interest rate wise, at the top, and they're going to be either stuck trying to refinance fixed at a much higher rate to try and lock something in that's somewhat affordable, or they're just going to feel the pain for a long time, because as a lot of people don't realize that, like, interest rates now are nearing the historical average. This is like normal interest rates, not they feel exponentially high, but in the fullness of time, they're actually about average. And so the people who are banking on interest rates to go back down to low twos, high ones, I think are dreaming, and they're going to really feel it if they don't plan financially for that reality.
Yeah, David Clement joining us. That's a good point you bring up about the interest rates, because that's been making headlines. For folks that aren't following Canada politics and the economy, which is not most of the world and probably about half of actual Canadians, what's kind of the headlines that folks should actually be paying attention to? You just mentioned it, the interest rates are up, but if you look over them historically, they're not, outrageously up. It's just comparatively up. There's a talk that the recession now may be deeper than they thought in Canada. The Bank of Canada has had some headlines and some press. The Trudeau government has obviously been talking a lot, quite frankly, kind of scattershot about different things, but they're talking about this. What's the outside observer that hasn't been keeping up with Canada? What should they be paying attention to that's been happening in the last few months that's really going to be the top line item going through 2023, do you think?
Yeah, I not to be too much of a doomsdayer, but I think that a recession is imminent. Often we'll hear from the federal government about job growth, but they'll very conveniently ignore where that job growth is. And so if you announce that we've overshot our job growth target. That's great. However, if 60, 70, 80% of that job growth is in the public service, that is not positive. Not necessarily because we don't need those jobs. Maybe we do need them. But that is not the same as private job growth and wealth generation in the private sphere, because ultimately those salaries and those jobs are paid by taxpayers. In order to pay those, you either run higher deficits, which furthers the inflation problem, or you're increasing taxes at a time when people are already stretched on their mortgage payments, on their grocery bills, on their gas taxes, you name it. So keep an eye, I would say, be skeptical of when some of these job figures come out in terms of where the jobs are. That's an important one. I would say that inflation is probably going to linger for longer than a lot of people first argued. I mean, we saw the same thing with the Biden administration, saying that this inflation is transitory. It's because of Putin. It's because of supply chains, etc. Some of that was, of course, true at the time, but it is not transitory. This is a monetary phenomenon, which it almost always is. So it's going to linger for a while, and unaffordability is going to become more of a problem and a political talking point moving forward. That would be my kind of two big takeaways on what's next. And then the real question is, do the provinces have the guts to force cities to build more homes? Because that's the back and forth right now. Is the province says we want to do X, but local city councilors are the decision makers, and you have to create incentives or penalties for municipalities who do build or don't want to build. And the Ford government in Ontario has somewhat done that. They've said you can't development charges on new builds. There's a cap. You can only charge so much. And because of what municipalities were doing, and we noticed this looking at the property taxes of older homes versus newer homes, even though they were the same price, would be double. And so municipalities are offloading a lot of the infrastructure tax burden onto new builds, where your property taxes will be double from the get-go, in order to try and prevent having to raise property taxes on existing residents. And that's creating really weird mismatch where like so much as crossing one road can make a difference property tax wise. Although both houses are 900,000 or a million or 1.1 million, one will have a $6,500 a year municipal tax bill. The other will have a $3,500 a year municipal tax bill. So we're going to see some pressure from provinces to really force cities to get their act together. And then what happens from that is the big question.
David Clement joining us. Is that, you just kind of touched on it, is the provinces and the municipalities and the big cities and the governments, is that the primary dynamic to keep an eye on right now? Because it feels like, especially since the end of the COVID restrictions, let's just go back that far, although this is lingering stuff that's always been there to some level. Is that the dynamic to really pay attention to? Because it does seem like that's been elevated quite a bit, at least in the last year or so, both politically and culturally.
Yeah, that is the dynamic to look at, because the federal government, in my opinion, is just tinkering at the margins. They don't necessarily have a role to play. It's not technically in their jurisdiction to handle much of housing, but there's a lot that the federal government now does that isn't in their jurisdiction at all, and yet they do it anyway. Like the Trudeau government's dental care announcement, that is not in the federal government's purview at all. Same with their childcare announcement, completely outside of the realm of what the federal government is supposed to do, and yet they're still doing it. And so, if we've crossed that bridge, I don't see any justification for not adding housing targets into it. And I've long argued that if the Trudeau government was serious about getting municipalities to build, they would just withhold federal infrastructure money based on growth targets for especially these high demand areas. They haven't really, the Trudeau government has taken kind of a lukewarm approach to that. There's not much teeth to it. The conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has been a little more aggressive, where he said cities over 500,000 would be under essentially some set of review, where they have to meet a certain target or they don't get federal funds, which is a lot for these big cities because they rely on the federal government to help build things like subways and major infrastructure and transit and road expansion and all of that. So either the federal government needs to be much more aggressive, or the provincial government is going to have to pick up whatever slack's left behind and put that pressure on the cities to get this done.
Yeah, David Clement, Consumer Choice Center, all kinds of stuff he does, writing and broadcasting wise. You mentioned it. We're 7 years, almost to the day, 7 years into Justin Trudeau now.
Mm-hmm.
I think we got a long track record here. He's got, 2 years or so before he's up again. Where are we at with him? Is there Trudeau fatigue? Is there a bit of a rut that this administration seems to be in a little bit? They're past the COVID stuff now, but the economy's not doing super great. People seem a little, they're not up in arms over it, but there is some discontent. Look, at some point, if you got a sports team, you've heard all the coaches' speeches, you've heard all the jokes, you've heard all the motivational stuff. It kind of feels like we're kind of at that point with Justin Trudeau now. We've seen kind of everything in his repertoire. What does he do here going forward, do you think?
So, under normal circumstances, I would say that, yeah, this would probably be the last go for Trudeau, and that the Liberal, like if I was in the executive committee for the Liberal Party, I would be starting the process of, okay, when is he going to make an announcement that he's stepping aside? When are we going to have a leadership race to kind of revamp party membership and get things moving again? The Liberal partisans, especially the ones on Twitter, hate it when I say this, but the Liberal Party in Canada very much mirrors what the Republican Party looked like under Trump, where I think they will stay on board until the ship has fully sunk. When that is, I do not know. But just so much of the party is around one person and revolves around one person that there seems to be a reluctancy to move on. If I was a Liberal partisan, I would be one of the people who would be putting pressure on the party to pass the torch. They have really good voter efficiency. So because we have a first past the post system with multiple parties, the Liberals do a very good job of winning competitive ridings with 31, 32, 35% of the vote. The Conservatives do not have as good of voter efficiency as the Liberals, and they're really the only other party who could form government. So you can get 90% of the vote in Fort McMurray, but realistically, and this is no criticism to the fine people of Fort McMurray, every vote over that 50% mark is has no electoral advantage for the Conservatives, which is why the Conservatives have won the popular vote 2 elections in a row, but not formed government. So some of that, I think, is weighing on maybe some of the reluctancy to start the retirement party for Trudeau. But I think it's necessary if I'm forecasting. If we continue to see increases in crime in major cities, and some of it is hysteria, but some of it is very real, in the Greater Toronto area and Vancouver, and we start to see the recession kick in and people lose their jobs or and things like that, or lose their homes as a combination of the two, that is a ripe time for a conservative to come along who is fiscally minded, who is maybe more of a law and order candidate, to attract the middle centrist voters in the suburbs, which is what the conservatives need. So if I see that on the chessboard, you have to be having a conversation within the party if you're a liberal and say, okay, well, how do we counter this? Because the fatigue is only going to get worse. The economic turmoil will most likely continue to get worse. And the other factors at play here should mean that in theory, it would be the conservatives' election to lose. But they are also notoriously good at losing elections that are theirs to lose. So I'm not putting. I wouldn't take that statement to the bank.
Yeah, David Clement. That's a universal principle, I think,
Yeah.
snatching victory from the jaws of defeat and then putting it right back down the gullet of defeat. An interesting sideshow to some of that. One thing that affects all Canadians, of course, is Canada's national healthcare system.
Mm-hmm.
We use it in America as both a Mott and the Bailey for healthcare discussions, but you all actually have to live with it, deal with it, and handle it.
Yep.
Interesting crack in the system here. Doug Ford, the Premier, of course, of Ontario, who's an interesting character in his own right that you love to talk about,
I do.
is having a little bit of a foray into privatized healthcare. Now, Trudeau's kind of really keeping an eye on this, and he's made some wide swath statements here. It's a small thing. It's a little thing. I don't know how much it'll amount to anything, but it is an interesting thing.
Mm-hmm. We'll see how it pans out in terms of what it actually looks like in practice. But the idea is that we just have private service providers or alleviating all of the backlogs that we see for a lot of the somewhat minor surgeries and things like that, routine scans, MRIs, and things that kind of fall into that category. And for American listeners, an example of like how severe it can be. So it's anecdotal, but it's my own. And this was before COVID. These problems in the healthcare system are not COVID specific. They were exacerbated by COVID, but they've existed for a long time. I had to have a minor sinus surgery. I think I went in. So from the time in which I first got referred from my doctor to the specialist was about 6 months. I went to the specialist and she said, okay, are you available for surgery? And she gave me a date. It was like March 2019. And that was 8 months from when I saw the specialist. So we're talking well over a year total time from like the I have a problem that needs fixing to actually going under the knife. Now, for me, it was an inconvenience. It wasn't debilitating. But you have people who, let's say, don't have the luxury of working like I do remotely and with a laptop. Let's say you work outside, you build homes, you do all of those very important jobs, and you tear an MCL. You can't really afford to wait 9-12 months for surgery. That needs to happen now. And so if we can get closer to those things happening now, it's going to be a huge benefit. And the way the Ford government is saying is there's no out-of-pocket expense. They're just billing the province. It's still single payer. These private clinics, doctors, etc., are just billing the province through your OHIP card, which is your provincial health card. So when framed like that, I think it could be very good. How it pans out, the jury is still out. But if we have more options to use our healthcare dollars, essentially, to get quicker service, that is a huge plus.
Yeah, David Clement joining us. The thing is, to the American audience, that's like, well, that's how it's supposed to work. Problem is, there's folks, especially certain Canadian politicians, that think this is absolute heresy and have basically called it as much. I know our British friends joke about the National Health Service over there being the official state religion. I don't think it's quite that bad in Canada, but some of the reaction here, you would think it certainly was, calls for inquisition on why in the world are we putting this crack in the wall. It's a culture divide with a U.S. audience to why that would be so harsh to y'all.
Yeah.
But just kind of explain why that's such a throwback, because it goes back to those other things we're talking about. Who's controlling funding, provincial government, federal government. There's a lot of layers to these sorts of things, isn't there?
There are, and I think for the people who are up in arms about this, they view it as the Americanization of healthcare, which it is not. If anything, it's more of a European model. And Canadian politicians who want healthcare to be 100% public, meaning from the insurance card that you have, to the doctor that you go to the surgeon, to the literal building in which you have that surgery, to be owned by the government. They're up in arms and they think this is crazy. But if you look at Europe, they conveniently forget that Europe exists, and that virtually every country, including the UK, has some sort of option to allow for private care to fill the void or fill the gaps where we have long wait and terrible care and all of that. So they always look at the US and they'll share like, oh, this woman gave birth and she got the bill and it was like 70 grand. Like, how is it working? Like, do we really want this in Ontario? It's like, well, no, that's not what anybody is advocating for. It's more of a shift towards what Europe does, which is a blend of the two. In many systems, you have single payer, but the hospital may be privately owned. The clinic may be privately owned. They bill the province accordingly, or they bill the state accordingly, and you get quicker care. And for Canadians who really care about the universality, they can't separate the fact that you can have universality without the government actually owning the hospital. They think that it all has to be the same, and it's just not true. If you get the horse blinders off and you take a look at how healthcare is run around the world.
Yeah, David Clement, Consumer Choice Center. For those of us that only periodically check in with Canada, either our neighbors or north or the worldwide audience, look, we only got so much bandwidth and we got our own messes. Give us one or two things to be on the lookout for. I know we already talked about things like the economy and the housing and the healthcare stuff. What's one or two things to just kind of bookmark that may cut through onto more of the American or the international audience down the road a little bit, but we should bookmark it now? Like, hey, go ahead and kind of tab this one out because you're going to be hearing from it here down the road a little bit.
So I think crime is a big one, because with now our sensitivity to crime is, our bar for our sensitivity to crime is a lot lower than in the US. And so I don't have the numbers on me, but if I were to quote the numbers, most American listeners would be like, well, that's like 1/20th of Chicago. That's not a crisis or a problem. But we are seeing an increase, especially in the Greater Toronto area, of random crime. There was one in Toronto where a group of 5 or 6 teenage girls beat a homeless man to death. Now that's a headline and it's anecdotal, but then you couple that with like an increase in things like carjackings, very violent, like in your face crime. And it starts to become something that is then a topic of discussion politically. Things like the re-release of violent offenders is another common one, where in many instances the criminal justice reform world gets lost. And I say this because I'm definitely in the criminal justice reform world in terms of victimless crime. But I'm certainly not in regards to violent crime. And you'll have instances where people will be granted early release for a variety of reasons, overcrowding or in air quotes, compassion, and then they reoffend in a violent way. As that continues to happen, it becomes campaign fodder for the conservatives. And so I think we'll see that become more of a talking point. Not to US levels, but it will become a major conversation.
Yeah, David Clement, Consumer Choice Center, been a friend of ours since the beginning. I started doing broadcasting and writing, which I appreciate greatly, sir. I didn't throw you your softball about liquor in Canada. We'll talk about that next time. But until we get you back on again, it won't be as long this time, I promise. Let folks know how they can keep up with you, what you got going on, and follow you until we get you back on Heard Tell again.
Yeah, so you can follow me on Twitter at Clement Liberty. The organization's website is consumerchoicecenter.org, where we talk about internationally, basically how things impact consumers, everything from sin taxes to free trade to how do we handle companies like Huawei. So lots of good content there on the policy side, both in the United States, Canada, and the rest of the world.
Yeah, you do good work, sir. We always enjoy the conversation. David Clement, appreciate the time, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Folks, if you've listened to the Heard Tell program, you've heard our friend Gabriella Hoffman, but you need to make sure you're checking out her podcast, District of Conservation. It's a podcast exploring the nuances of true conservation efforts from DC and beyond. From topic discussions to exclusive interviews with conservation and energy newsmakers, Gabriella keeps listeners appraised of the latest news stories while elevating important voices. Listen to District of Conservation on Apple Podcasts or wherever podcasts are played.
Religion is at the intersection of our 21st century life, even if we don't express a faith. At a time when it seems that religion isn't as prevalent as it once was, it still leaves its mark everywhere. As a pastor, I know that religion isn't something I just do on a Sunday, but it's found in every nook and cranny of my life. Sexuality, politics, social media, the economy, war, nationalism, all have some kind of religious angle to them. And as a communicator, I want to find the stories that can help people understand this part of our society that is so important to so many. Hi, I'm Dennis Sanders, and I'm the host of Church and Main. Church and Main is a podcast about the journey of faith and where it intersects with modern life. I look at faith with a journalist's eye, asking the who, where, what, why, and how religion affects some of the major issues of the day. Join me as we journey together. You can listen to Church and Main podcasts at the website churchandmain.org or on your favorite podcast app. I look forward to seeing you.